The following teaching is possible thanks to the friends and partners of Spirit and Truth Fellowship International.
You know, anybody who studies the Bible, and especially the way Jesus Christ talked, knows that when he spoke, he wove just common ordinary experiences and things from ordinary life into what he was teaching. Well, that really works if the ordinary life of his time period is the same as the ordinary life of our time period. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. And there's an illustration that Jesus wove into one of his teachings that has caused Christians some difficulty. Let's take a look at it. It's in Matthew chapter 22. It's actually a really important illustration to understand because of where he's teaching. So in Matthew 22, we're going to come back and pick this up in more detail, but I want to give an overview first. He's teaching to the Pharisees who've come to test him, and starting in verse 37, he says, we're to love God with all of our heart, and we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. And then in verse 40, Matthew 22:40, he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And that's actually a very simple concept, although many Christians don't quite get what he's talking about. And what he's talking about is a very simple illustration. Something that was essential in the ancient household was simply a wall peg. Now, I'm sitting here in my office. You can see my books behind me, for example, and there on the back of my door is a hook, a peg, if you will, from which our coats are hung. And in the hallway out there, my shirts and stuff, out there in the hallway, we've got pegs. In the biblical world, which didn't have closets, certainly didn't have coat hangers, pegs were essential for organization. And so they're spoken about, even though they're not actually spoken about directly. Like here in the verse, Jesus didn't say anything about a peg. He just said, the law and the prophets hang on this, and everybody would instantly realize, wow, Christ is talking about a peg, and they would get what he was saying, that love was like a peg on a wall. It gave order and organization and meaning to the rest of the prophets. And what I'd like to do is just kind of march through the scripture a little bit, just to see some of the illustrations of pegs in the scripture, so we can kind of learn more about them and get more of the fact that, yeah, this really was a common illustration. I'd start in Ezekiel chapter 15, and in Ezekiel 15, starting in verse 1, the word of the Lord, the word of Yahweh, came to me, Son of man, how is the wood of a vine better than a branch of any of the trees in the forest? Is wood ever taken from it to make anything useful? Do they make pegs from it to hang things on? And the answer, of course, is no. You don't take the wood of a vine and make a peg. Why? It's weak. It's inferior wood. It would break. And so one of the things we learn about the pegs in the ancient world is they had to be firm. They had to be sturdy. In Isaiah chapter 22, God is speaking, and he's talking about one of the leaders that he's going to put in place. And he says, in that day I will summon my servant Eliakim, son of Hilkiah. Verse 23, I will drive him like a peg into a firm place. And then in verse 24, talking about how strong Eliakim would be for his people, he says, the glory of his family will hang on him. Using the same illustration that Jesus used, where on the peg, if you will, of love, hang the whole law and the prophets. And here God just says, this guy Eliakim, his whole family is going to hang on him. He's going to be so strong, he's going to be able to hold up his whole family. Of course, interestingly enough, Eliakim was a human being. He did eventually give way. And so in verse 25 of Isaiah 22, it says, in that day, declares Lord Almighty, the peg driven into the firm place will give way. It will be sheared off and fall, and the load hanging on it will be cut down, says the NIV. Some of the other versions read destroyed, which I think is true. We have to realize when you're, and this will relate to what Jesus said too, that when you're hanging things from pegs in the ancient world, like your clay jars that you want to keep up off the dirt floor so nobody kicks them and breaks them, like your wine skins and stuff. A lot of times if the peg broke, what you hung up there was just destroyed. It wasn't just made dirty and disorganized in the dirt. It was actually destroyed. Let's look at Psalm 119, verse 83. I love this psalm. And again, like as with Christ, the peg is only implied in the psalm. And he says, though I'm like a wineskin in the smoke, I do not forget your decrees. That's Psalm 119:83. I'm like a wineskin in the smoke. What's that even about? You see, in the ancient world, they didn't have chimneys in the common houses, so they just built a fire on the floor. And of course, the room stayed filled with smoke, but everybody's sitting on the floor. They're lying on the floor. And so, as a result, the heavy smoke was above them. But the wineskin would be hung up in the smoke. And the psalmist, in a wonderful psalm, says that, if I'm like a wineskin hung up in the smoke, it's just uncomfortable and thick around me, and I seem to be neglected. He says, I won't neglect, I won't forget your decrees. Then in Zechariah 10:4, and you can do a whole teaching on Zechariah 10:4, it talks about the names of Jesus Christ, and it says, from Judah will come the cornerstone. Of course, Jesus Christ is the cornerstone. From him, from Judah, the tent peg. And this is, again, the pegs that were used and the hooks that were used in the houses, in the tents. And the point is that by calling Jesus Christ the tent peg, he's the one that gives order and meaning to our lives. He's the one that keeps us from being destroyed, literally destroyed, in the dirt, if you will. So let's go back to Matthew chapter 22. And here in Matthew 22, Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. And it says that one of them, in verse 35, an expert of the law, tested him with this question. So here come the Pharisees with a test. Teacher, what's the great commandment in the law? And what's Jesus Christ tell him? He says, love God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, these commandments had to be especially meaningful to the Pharisees because they were really big on picayune obedience. They loved, all the little nitpicky things of the law. But they often omitted love. And as Christians, we have to be careful of this. Sometimes we can get so excited about simply obeying the commandments that we forget about how valuable love is. And so here's what Jesus Christ, after telling this Pharisee, this lawyer from this nitpicky organization, if you will, this nitpicky sect, that he says, love God and love your neighbor. And then he says, hey, let me tell you how it is. On these two commandments, on the commandment of love God and love your neighbor, all the law and the prophets hang. It's just like God just drove this huge tent peg into the wall of his temple, and that tent peg is love, and he takes all the other commandments and he hangs them right up on there. And he says, I want you to see how this is. Love. It's love that gives meaning in order to the other commandments. It's love that allows us to see the beauty of the commandments, and they're not in some disheveled heap on the dirt floor. It's love that allows us to be able to reach in and use the commandments the way they're supposed to be used instead of just digging through a pile of disorganized things on the floor. And it's love that even allows those commandments to function without being destroyed, because as I said, when the tent pegs broke, a lot of times what was on the floor was smashed, or things on the floor like a jar or a wineskin got kicked and it got broken. So what a beautiful illustration here in the teaching of Jesus Christ, talking to people, the Pharisees, who really needed love, and pointing out to them that the great commandment and the second commandment in the law were all about love, loving God and loving your neighbor, and then kind of kicking back and telling them, guys, I'm going to tell you the way it is. On those two commandments, all the law and the prophets hang, and they do. let's make sure that we're hanging our works on the great tent peg of love.